Hey there, and welcome to Crime for Sleep. I know you're having trouble falling asleep, so let me keep you company with true crime stories from around the world. Before we dive in, I'm curious, where did you first hear this one? If you enjoy these stories, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. Now get comfortable, and let's get into tonight's case. Story 1. It wasn't the first time I noticed the flicker in the hallway. The morning routine unfolded with the same placid rhythm, coffee dripping, clock ticking. Yet I caught myself pausing at the entry, observing specks of dust slowly spiraling in a sunbeam that shouldn't have been there. I walked past the door ajar, its creak barely audible, almost drowned out by the hum of distant traffic. The floor seemed colder, though it wasn't noticeable unless you stood still. The day proceeded without disruption, and I finished my chores, leaving the door slightly open. It seemed pointless to close it now. The dust motes dance differently when you're not supposed to be watching them. I remember thinking that, but I can't place when. Maybe it was the same morning, or maybe it was weeks before. Memory has this way of folding in on itself, doesn't it? Like when you're trying to recall a conversation and all you get are fragments. Did you check? And I thought you would, and the sound of footsteps on linoleum. There was a pattern to the way the light fell, I'm certain of that much. It would hit the wall at an angle that created shadows where shadows shouldn't exist. The door frame cast a line across the floor, and sometimes I would catch myself stepping over it as if crossing some invisible boundary. Other times I would stand directly on it, feeling the slight temperature change beneath my feet. I found myself returning to that spot throughout the day. Not consciously, you understand. I would simply discover myself there, coffee mug in hand or holding a dish towel, staring at that rectangle of brightness. The dust particles moved in currents I couldn't feel, following air patterns that seemed to originate from beyond the partially open door. The hallway stretched longer than it should have. I measured it once, pacing heel to toe, but the numbers never seemed consistent. 12 steps, then 14, then 11. Perhaps I was miscounting, or perhaps the act of measuring was changing something fundamental about the space itself. The walls held their secrets close, painted in a color I could never quite name. Not white, not cream, but something in between that shifted depending on the light. You left it open again. The voice comes back to me now, though I can't attach it to a face or a moment. It carried a note of resignation, as if this was an ongoing discussion we'd had before. But who was speaking, and when? The memory feels borrowed, like something overheard rather than experienced. I started keeping track of the door's position, not writing it down, nothing so formal, but making mental notes throughout the day. Morning, 3 inches ajar. Afternoon, slightly wider, maybe 4 inches. Evening, back to 3 inches, or perhaps 2. The variations seemed deliberate, though I was the only one making adjustments. Or was I? The flicker intensified during certain weather patterns. Overcast days made it more pronounced, as if the absence of direct sunlight allowed something else to emerge. The dust would swirl in tighter spirals, creating brief geometric patterns before dissolving back into randomness. I began to anticipate these moments, positioning myself in the hallway before they occurred. There were sounds, too, not quite footsteps, but something rhythmic and soft, like fabric brushing against itself or papers being shuffled in a distant room. The sounds seemed to emanate from beyond the door, though when I pressed my ear to the gap, I heard only silence. The absence was more unsettling than any noise would have been. It's always been like this. Another fragment, another voice without context, or maybe it was my own voice spoken to someone I can no longer recall. The words carried certainty, but about what? The door, the light, the gradual way things had begun to shift without anyone acknowledging the change. I developed habits around the hallway, small rituals that felt necessary, though I couldn't explain why. I would touch the door frame when passing, always with my left hand. I would count the dust motes visible in the sunbeam, stopping at 7. I would hold my breath while crossing the threshold between the bright patch and the darker sections of the floor. These behaviors felt ancient, as if I'd been performing them for much longer than I could remember. Yet they also felt newly formed, responses to something that had only recently begun to demand attention. The contradiction didn't trouble me then. Now, trying to piece it together, the inconsistency feels significant. The door began to occupy more of my thoughts. During conversations, I would find myself distracted by its presence down the hall. While reading, my eyes would drift toward the rectangle of light it created. At night, lying in bed, I would listen for the subtle sounds of it settling into its frame, though I was never certain I actually heard anything. I started leaving things near the door. Not deliberately, but objects seemed to migrate there of their own accord. A pen I'd been using would appear on the floor nearby. A book would be found leaning against the wall, though I had no memory of placing it there. These discoveries felt like messages, though I couldn't decode their meaning. "You're imagining things." This voice is clearer, more recent. It carries impatience, maybe concern. But the speaker remains faceless, a presence felt rather than seen. Did I respond? Did I argue the point? Or did I simply nod and change the subject? The conversation exists in isolation, disconnected from any larger context. The temperature variations became more pronounced. The cold spot near the door spread, creating a microclimate that extended several feet into the hallway. I would pause there during warm afternoons, grateful for the unexpected coolness. But the relief was always temporary, replaced by an unease I couldn't name. I began to suspect that the door's position was changing when I wasn't looking. Not dramatically, just subtle shifts that accumulated over time. I would leave it at a specific angle and return to find it slightly different. The changes were small enough to attribute to settling or air currents, but they followed no pattern I could discern. The dust told stories I couldn't read. Its movement seemed choreographed, following invisible currents that responded to influences beyond my perception. Sometimes the particles would cluster in specific areas, creating temporary constellations before dispersing. Other times they would avoid certain spots entirely, leaving pockets of clear air that felt significant. I found myself talking to the hallway, not out loud but in my mind, directing thoughts toward the space as if it were capable of listening. I would ask questions about the temperature changes, about the shifting light patterns, about the way the door seemed to breathe with the house's rhythm. The hallway never answered, but its silence felt attentive. "This has to stop," the voice returns with urgency, though the context remains elusive. Was someone referring to my growing obsession with the door, or was there something else, something I'm still not remembering? The words feel weighted with consequences I can't grasp. I started avoiding the hallway during certain parts of the day. Not from fear exactly, but from a sense that my presence was somehow interfering with processes that required solitude. I would take longer routes to reach other parts of the house, circling around rather than passing through. But I always returned eventually, drawn by a curiosity that felt larger than my own. The shadows began to move independently of their sources. Subtle shifts that occurred in my peripheral vision, gone by the time I turned to look directly. The door frame's shadow would extend or contract without corresponding changes in the light. These movements felt purposeful, as if the shadows were responding to cues I couldn't perceive. I wondered if others had noticed the changes, but who were these others? The question itself revealed gaps in my memory that felt deliberately created. There should have been people to ask, conversations to have, confirmations to seek. Instead, there was only the hallway and its patient accumulation of mysteries. The flicker became a constant companion. I would catch it in my peripheral vision throughout the day, a reminder of the door's presence even when I was focused elsewhere. It pulsed with a rhythm that seemed almost biological, like a heartbeat made of light and shadow. You know what this means. The voice is my own now, I'm certain of it. But when did I speak these words, and to whom? The certainty in the tone suggests understanding, but I feel only confusion when I try to grasp the meaning. The knowledge hovers just beyond reach, like the dust motes dancing in light that shouldn't exist. I began to document the door's behavior, not in writing but through careful observation. I memorized the exact angle of its opening, the precise width of the gap it created, the way the light fell across the threshold. These details felt crucial, though I couldn't say why. They were clues to a puzzle I hadn't consciously acknowledged I was trying to solve. The hallway grew longer in my memory, stretching beyond its physical dimensions. I could walk its length in a dozen steps, but in my mind it extended much further, disappearing into distances that defied the house's architecture. The door existed somewhere in this expanded space, both near and impossibly far away. The dust motes continue their spiral dance, indifferent to my attempts at understanding. They follow currents I cannot feel, responding to influences I cannot detect. Their movement is the only constant in a space that seems to shift whenever I'm not watching. And still, I find myself returning to that spot in the hallway, drawn by the flicker of light that dances where it shouldn't, carrying secrets I'm not sure I want to remember. The door remains ajar, waiting with infinite patience for something I can almost but not quite recall. Story 2. It happened each morning without fail, a gentle thud echoing from the hallway as doors closed in sequence, a neighborly symphony that promised routine and order. 7 doors, one after the other in precise rhythm, never out of step. I began to rely on it as much as my morning coffee, a comforting backdrop to waking thoughts, until last Tuesday when the 6th door stuck for a heartbeat longer, and today the 7th barely made a sound at all. I found myself listening more intently, yet unsure if I heard anything at all. The coffee cup sits cold against my palm now, ceramic smooth and unforgiving. Steam stopped rising 20 minutes ago, maybe longer. Time moves differently when you're counting sounds that may not exist. I press my ear to the wall. The plaster feels cool, slightly textured. Paint chips dust my cheek. When did I start doing this? When did listening become an obsession rather than habit? The building manager had kind eyes, I remember that much. Or perhaps I'm confusing her with someone else. Memory plays tricks when you're trying too hard to hold on to details. Has anyone mentioned irregularities? I asked her. She tilted her head, pen hovering over paperwork. What kind of irregularities? The morning routine, the doors. People come and go, that's what people do. But that wasn't what I meant. I meant the precision, the careful choreography that had suddenly developed gaps, missing beats in a familiar song. The hallway carpet shows wear patterns, 7 distinct paths leading from 7 doors to the stairwell. Some paths deeper than others, suggesting different weights, different gaits, different frequencies of travel. The 7th path seems lighter somehow, more hesitant. I walk it sometimes, measuring my steps against the impressions left by others. 23 steps from the door to the stairs. I count each one, feeling the slight give of padding beneath worn fabric. The woman from apartment 7 had a particular way of closing her door. Not gentle, not harsh, deliberate, final. like someone who understood the importance of boundaries, of clear demarcations between inside and outside, private and public, safe and uncertain. Had past tense. When did I start thinking in past tense? My notebook contains 17 entries about the morning sequence. 17 days of careful documentation, times recorded to the minute, observations noted with what I believed was scientific precision. Reading them now, I see patterns I missed before, or patterns that weren't there before, or patterns I imagined into existence. Day 1, 7 doors, perfect sequence, 7:23 to 7:31 a.m. Day 6, 6th door hesitated, mechanical issue, occupant distracted. Day 12, 7th door softer than usual, oil on hinges. Day 17, cannot confirm 7th door closed at all. The building superintendent carries keys that jangle with each step, 43 keys on a ring that seems too heavy for practical use. I've counted them 3 times, always arriving at the same number, though I can't explain why this matters. Maintenance requests, he asked when I approached him in the basement. Not exactly, more like a wellness check. His expression shifted, became guarded. On who? The woman in 7, I haven't heard her door. Haven't heard it what? Close in the morning sequence. He studied me for a long moment, keys still jangling slightly in his grip. You keep track of people's doors. The question hung between us like an accusation. Do I keep track, or do I simply notice? Is there a difference between observation and surveillance, between concern and intrusion? The 7th door looks identical to all the others. Same color, same hardware, same small peephole that reflects the hallway light in a tiny, distorted circle. I've stood before it 17 times, hand raised to knock, never quite making contact. What would I say? That I've been listening to her morning routine, that her absence from the sequence has disrupted something fundamental in my understanding of how this building works, how its inhabitants move through their prescribed patterns. The mailboxes in the lobby tell stories in accumulated dust and forwarding stickers. 7 boxes, 7 names, 7 lives reduced to surnames and apartment numbers. The 7th box shows no recent collection. Mail accumulates behind a small glass window like sediment in still water. But mail service can be irregular. People travel. People change their delivery preferences. The accumulation might mean everything or nothing. I find myself returning to the lobby at different times, noting which boxes have been emptied, which show fresh deposits. The pattern emerges slowly, inconsistently. 6 boxes maintain regular cycles of filling and emptying. The 7th remains static, unchanging, a repository for increasingly urgent-looking envelopes. The night security guard works crossword puzzles during quiet hours. I've seen him through the glass doors, pen moving slowly across printed squares, occasionally pausing to tap against his teeth. He knows the building's rhythms better than anyone, witnesses the late arrivals, the early departures, the anomalies that break routine. Quiet night, I asked him once, having invented an excuse to return after forgetting my keys. They're all quiet, he replied without looking up from his puzzle, until they're not. The woman in 7, have you seen her recently? His pen stopped moving. Why do you ask? Just wondering, we used to nod in the hallway. When was that? I couldn't answer. The nodding existed in my memory as a general truth rather than specific incidents. We nodded, therefore we had a relationship, therefore I had a right to wonder about her absence. But when, where, the details dissolved under examination. The building's heating system creates its own symphony. Pipes expand and contract, radiators hiss and gurgle, the boiler in the basement cycles on and off with mechanical precision. I've learned to distinguish between normal building sounds and anomalies, between the expected and the concerning. From apartment 7, silence. Not the comfortable silence of someone moving quietly, but the absolute silence of space unoccupied, air unstirred, floorboards unweighted. Yet silence can be deceiving. People live quietly. People work nights and sleep days. People travel for extended periods without informing neighbors of their schedules. Silence might indicate absence or simply discretion. The police officer who responded to my call had tired eyes and careful handwriting. She took notes in a small pad, asking questions that revealed the weakness in my concerns. When did you last see her? I'm not sure I ever actually saw her. But you knew she lived there. I heard her door every morning. For how long? Since I moved in. Which was when? Time collapsed. I couldn't place the beginning of my residency in relation to other events, couldn't establish a timeline that would satisfy official inquiry. The morning sequence had simply always existed until it didn't. We can request a wellness check, she said finally, but we need more than irregular door sounds. More than irregular door sounds. The phrase followed me home, echoing in the stairwell, bouncing off walls that had witnessed whatever happened or didn't happen behind the 7th door. The building manager's office smells of old coffee and copy toner. Files line metal shelves in no apparent order, creating an archive of tenancy that spans decades. She found the 7th apartment's folder after several minutes of searching. Current on rent, she said, scanning documents. No complaints, no maintenance requests. No contact recently. Rent comes automatically, direct deposit. Automatic payments create the illusion of presence. Money moves through electronic channels, maintaining the fiction of normal life even when normal life has ceased. The system continues operating in the absence of the person who set it in motion. Emergency contact, I asked. She hesitated, recognizing the boundary between legitimate inquiry and privacy invasion. Family out of state, but I can't share details. Out of state, the phrase suggested distance, both geographical and emotional. Someone who wouldn't notice a missed phone call, who might assume silence indicated busyness rather than absence. I dream about the 7th door now. In the dreams, it opens and closes with perfect timing, restoring the sequence, returning order to my mornings. But when I approach to thank the occupant, the doorway reveals only darkness, a space that extends beyond the apartment's logical boundaries. The dreams feel more real than my waking observations, more trustworthy than my documented evidence. In the dreams, the woman from apartment 7 has a face, a voice, a presence that fills the space her absence has created. But I wake before she speaks, before she explains where she's been, before she restores the broken pattern. The 7th door's lock shows scratches around the keyhole. Fresh scratches, or scratches I'm noticing for the first time. Metal on metal leaves marks, but determining when those marks were made requires expertise I don't possess. The scratches could indicate recent use, forced entry, or simply the accumulated wear of normal operation. I photographed the lock with my phone, studying the image for details invisible to casual observation. The scratches form patterns suggesting specific tools, particular techniques, but patterns can be imaginary, imposed by minds seeking meaning in random marks. The building's laundry room operates on quarters and patience. Residents come and go with baskets and detergent, creating temporary communities around shared appliances. I've begun spending time there, ostensibly washing clothes, actually listening for information about the seventh apartment. She kept to herself, said the woman from the third floor, polite but private. Past tense again. When had we all agreed to speak of her in past tense? Did she do laundry here? Sometimes late at night, usually, after everyone else finished. Late night laundry suggests someone who avoided crowds, who preferred solitude to casual interaction. Someone who might disappear without generating immediate concern because she had already made herself nearly invisible. The maintenance closet on each floor contains circuit breakers, water shutoffs, and access panels for building systems. The seventh floor's closet shows signs of recent use. Fresh footprints in accumulated dust, tools moved from their usual positions. Someone has been checking systems, investigating problems, responding to issues that haven't been reported through normal channels. Electrical problem in 7, I told the superintendent when I encountered him in the basement. Who reported it? I noticed the lights flickering. From outside the apartment. Through the window from the courtyard. Lies accumulate like dust, each one making the next easier to tell. I hadn't seen flickering lights, hadn't been watching the seventh apartment's windows, hadn't developed the surveillance habits my story implied. But the lie served a purpose, created an excuse for investigation. He climbed the stairs with obvious reluctance, keys jangling with each step. At the seventh door he knocked 3 times, waited, knocked again. The sound echoed in the hallway, unanswered and somehow final. No response, he said, stating the obvious. Should you check inside? Need permission or emergency circumstances? What constitutes emergency circumstances? He looked at me with new suspicion, recognizing the question's implications. Why do you want to know? Why did I want to know? The morning sequence had been disrupted, but disruption isn't emergency. The mail accumulated, but accumulation isn't crisis. The silence continued, but silence isn't catastrophe. My concerns felt urgent to me but appeared trivial to others, suggesting the problem might exist primarily in my perception rather than reality. The courtyard provides partial views into ground floor apartments. From the right angle, at the right time, with the right lighting conditions, interior spaces become visible to observers who know where to look. I don't know where to look, but I've been trying to learn. The seventh apartment's windows remain consistently dark. No movement behind curtains, no shadows crossing illuminated spaces, no signs of habitation that would indicate normal occupancy. But darkness might indicate drawn shades rather than absence, privacy preferences rather than vacancy. The building's trash collection follows a weekly schedule. Residents place bags in the basement storage area, creating temporary monuments to consumption and disposal. 6 apartments contribute regularly. The seventh contributes nothing, adding absence to the accumulating evidence of non-presence. But people generate different amounts of waste. Some recycle obsessively, reducing their contribution to nearly nothing. some compost organic matter, removing another category from the waste stream. The absence of trash might indicate environmental consciousness rather than physical absence. The woman from apartment 5 waters plants in the hallway, creating an unauthorized garden that brightens the institutional space. She's been doing this longer than I've lived here, establishing precedent that grants informal permission. The building feels different lately, she said while adjusting a philodendron's position. Different how? Quieter, less energy, like someone turned down the volume. Energy and volume aren't measurable quantities, but her observation matched my own sense of disruption. The building's atmosphere had shifted in ways that transcended the missing door sound, encompassing changes too subtle for documentation but too significant for dismissal. Have you seen the woman from 7? Not recently, but I never saw her much anyway. Not recently, the phrase carried weight without precision, suggesting awareness of absence without establishing timeline. When does recently become not recently? When does temporary absence become permanent disappearance? The 7th apartment's door handle shows where patterns different from the others. The metal appears polished smooth in specific areas, suggesting particular grips, consistent hand positions, habitual approaches to the simple act of entering and leaving. But the polish could result from cleaning products rather than use, maintenance rather than occupancy. I press my palm against the handle, feeling the smooth metal warm under my touch. The handle turns easily, too easily, as if the locking mechanism has been disengaged, but I don't push the door open. The boundary between concern and trespass remains clear, even as my curiosity grows stronger. The building's emergency contact list hangs in the lobby, protected behind glass like a museum exhibit. 7 apartments, 7 emergency contacts, 7 connections to the outside world. The 7th entry shows a phone number with an out-of-state area code, confirming the building manager's earlier statement. I memorize the number but don't call. What would I say? That I'm a neighbor who's been monitoring door sounds, that I've noticed irregularities in morning routines. The conversation would reveal more about my obsessions than about any legitimate emergency. The police officer's business card sits on my kitchen table, edges slightly worn from handling. She had given it to me with professional courtesy, acknowledging my concerns while making clear the limitations of official response. Call if you have additional information, she had said, defining additional as something more substantial than acoustic observations. Additional information. The phrase implies that my current information has value, just insufficient value for action. But what constitutes sufficient value? What threshold must be crossed before concern becomes investigation, before suspicion becomes fact? The building's lease agreements contain clauses about abandonment, defining the legal boundaries between temporary absence and permanent departure. 30 days without communication triggers specific procedures. 60 days allows for property removal. 90 days constitutes abandonment, permitting the landlord to reclaim the space. But these timeframes assume someone is counting, someone is monitoring, someone is maintaining official awareness of occupancy status. If no one complains, if rent continues arriving, if no problems are reported, an apartment might remain officially occupied long after actual abandonment. The 7th apartment's mailbox key hangs on the superintendent's ring, one of 43 keys that control access to every locked space in the building. The key appears unused recently, its metal surface showing none of the wear patterns that indicate regular handling. But appearances can deceive, and where patterns develop slowly, invisibly, like the erosion that shapes landscapes over geological time. I find myself counting keys whenever I encounter the superintendent, always arriving at the same total, always wondering about the purposes they serve. 43 locks, 43 responsibilities, 43 potential secrets waiting behind metal barriers. The building's insurance policy requires regular safety inspections, documented checks of smoke detectors, carbon monoxide sensors, and emergency systems. The inspection logs show completion dates for 6 apartments, with the 7th marked as access denied for the past 3 inspection cycles. Access denied suggests active refusal rather than absence, implies someone present to deny access rather than no one present to grant it. But the logs might be inaccurate, might reflect assumptions rather than actual encounters, might document bureaucratic convenience rather than reality. The heating bills for the 7th apartment continue at normal levels, suggesting either occupancy or inefficient systems that maintain temperature regardless of use. Heat rises through the building, creating thermal currents that blur the boundaries between individual units. The 7th apartment might stay warm through proximity rather than purpose, through physics rather than presence. But heating systems respond to demand, cycling on and off based on thermostat settings that require human adjustment. Consistent bills suggest consistent usage. Consistent usage suggests consistent presence. Consistent presence contradicts the accumulated evidence of absence. The woman from apartment 2 works night shifts and sleeps during morning hours when the door sequence typically occurs. Her schedule places her in the building during times when others are absent, creating opportunities for observation that daylight hours don't provide. I hear things, she told me in the laundry room, at night when everything's quiet. What kind of things? Footsteps sometimes, doors opening and closing, but not from 7, not anymore. Not anymore, another past tense construction, another acknowledgement of change, another confirmation that the disruption extends beyond my personal observations. The building's nighttime rhythms had shifted, creating new patterns of sound and silence. When did it stop? Hard to say exactly. These things happen gradually. You don't notice until after they've already changed. Gradual change evades detection, slips past attention, establishes itself as normal before anyone recognizes the transition. The woman from 7 might have been disappearing slowly, reducing her presence incrementally, fading like photographs exposed to too much light. The building's front desk receives packages for residents who aren't home during delivery hours. The 7th apartment has 3 packages waiting, accumulating like the mail, like the evidence, like the questions that multiply faster than answers. The packages bear return addresses from ordinary sources, a clothing retailer, a pharmacy, a subscription service. The content suggests normal life, ongoing needs, future plans, but packages can be ordered automatically, shipped on schedules established before the person who created those schedules disappeared. The delivery dates span 2 weeks, suggesting the absence began recently or the ordering patterns were established to continue indefinitely. Automatic systems create the illusion of presence, maintain the fiction of normal life, obscure the boundary between existence and non-existence. The building's security cameras record continuously, but store footage for only 30 days before overwriting. The relevant period might have already been erased, the evidence consumed by the same automated systems that create the illusion of presence in the first place. But 30 days provides a substantial archive, hours of footage that might contain answers to questions I haven't learned to ask. The cameras capture the lobby, the hallways, the entrances and exits that define the building's relationship with the outside world. Access to security footage requires a warrant, the building manager explained when I inquired about viewing capabilities. Even for residents. Especially for residents. The distinction surprised me. I had assumed residency granted certain privileges, certain rights to information about the building's operations. But privacy laws protect tenants from each other as much as from outside intrusion, creating barriers that prevent the kind of investigation my concerns seem to require. The seventh door's peephole reflects my image in miniature, distorting my features into something unrecognizable. I stare into the tiny lens, wondering if someone stares back, if my presence in the hallway registers on consciousness behind the door. But the reflection shows only my own eye, magnified and alien, looking back at itself. Peepholes work in one direction, granting interior observation of exterior space while maintaining privacy for the observer. The woman from 7 might be watching me now, might have been watching all along, might understand my concerns better than I understand them myself. But peepholes require someone present to look through them, someone alive to process visual information, someone capable of making decisions about whether to answer doors or acknowledge visitors. The peephole might be empty, might reflect only the building's hollow spaces, might show nothing to no one. The building's ventilation system connects all apartments through shared ductwork, creating pathways for sound and scent that transcend the boundaries between individual units. Cooking odors drift between floors, conversations carry through walls, presence announces itself through sensory channels that bypass visual confirmation. From the 7th apartment, nothing. No cooking smells, no conversation fragments, no signs of life that would travel through the building's respiratory system. The silence extends beyond sound into scent, beyond hearing into the full spectrum of sensory absence. But absence of evidence isn't evidence of absence. People live differently, cook differently, exist differently within the same physical constraints. The woman from 7 might have always been quiet, might have always maintained the kind of minimal presence that registers only through the morning door sequence. The sequence, everything returns to the sequence, to the rhythm that structured my mornings and gave meaning to the building's operations. 7 doors, 7 lives, 7 contributions to the symphony that promised order and continuity. Now 6 doors, 6 lives, 6 notes in a song that has lost its resolution. I wake earlier now, listening for sounds that don't come, counting beats in a rhythm that is broken. The missing 7th door haunts the sequence like a phantom limb, present through absence, significant through silence. The building manager has scheduled a wellness check for tomorrow morning, accompanied by police and emergency personnel. The accumulated evidence finally reached the threshold for official action. Unpaid utilities, uncollected mail, concerned neighbors, suspicious circumstances. But what if the door opens to reveal normal occupancy? What if the woman from 7 has been present all along, living quietly, maintaining privacy, existing within her rights to solitude? My observations will appear as surveillance, my concerns as obsession, my investigation as the real problem requiring attention. What if the door opens to reveal nothing at all? Empty rooms, abandoned furniture, spaces that contain no answers to the questions that brought us there. The mystery will deepen rather than resolve, will multiply rather than clarify, will leave us with more questions than we brought. What if the door doesn't open at all? I press my ear to the wall one final time, listening for sounds that might restore the sequence, might return order to my mornings, might explain the disruption that has consumed my attention and invaded my dreams. The silence continues, absolute and impenetrable, containing everything and nothing, answering all questions and no questions, promising resolution that never arrives. Tomorrow will bring official answers or official mysteries. Tonight brings only the certainty that something has changed, something has been lost, something that gave meaning to the simple act of listening has been disrupted beyond repair. The seventh door remains closed, silent, keeping its secrets behind wood and metal and the accumulated weight of unanswered questions. I return to my apartment, to my cold coffee, to my notebooks filled with observations that might mean everything or nothing. The morning will come without the seventh door, and I will listen anyway, hoping for restoration that may never arrive, counting sounds that may no longer exist, maintaining faith in a sequence that has already been broken. Story 3. I had just dusted the last pane, the air filled with the faint scent of lemon polish and neglect. My hands brushed over the tightly woven fibers of the carpet, noticing an uneven rise like a secret buried beneath. Every step I took seemed to whisper underfoot, the sound subtly wrong in its rhythm. I paused, letting the quiet claim the room, my breath the only disturbance. Yet something shifted in the stillness, a shadow of a whisper that felt like an accusation. Nothing moved, but I was certain the room had changed its gaze. The cleaning service had called me that morning. A straightforward job, they said. The client needed someone reliable, someone who wouldn't ask questions about why the house had been empty for weeks. I'd taken similar assignments before estate cleanings, foreclosure preparations, the aftermath of sudden departures. This felt no different, at least not at first. The house sat at the end of a quiet street, its windows dark even in daylight. The key was exactly where they'd told me it would be, hidden beneath a ceramic planter that held only dry soil and the brittle remains of what might have been roses. The lock turned easily, as if it had been waiting. Inside, everything appeared normal. Furniture arranged with careful precision, magazines fanned across the coffee table, a coffee mug sitting on the kitchen counter with a ring of dried residue at the bottom. Someone had left in a hurry, but not unusually so. I'd seen messier scenes, more obvious signs of distress. This was just abandonment, plain and simple. I worked methodically, room by room. The dust came away easily from most surfaces, suggesting the house hadn't been empty as long as they'd claimed. In the bedroom, clothes still hung in a closet, organized by color and season. The bathroom held the usual array of personal items: toothbrush, prescription bottles, a half-used tube of lipstick. Normal things, everyday things. But as I cleaned, small details began to accumulate in the corners of my awareness. The coffee mug in the kitchen wasn't just abandoned, it was positioned perfectly in the center of the counter, as if placed there deliberately. The magazines weren't scattered, they were arranged in a pattern, each one overlapping the next at precisely the same angle. The clothes in the bedroom hung with military precision, all facing the same direction, all spaced exactly the same distance apart. I told myself these were the habits of a meticulous person, someone who valued order. Some people lived that way. I'd cleaned houses where every book was alphabetized, where canned goods were arranged by expiration date. Obsessive organization wasn't unusual. Yet something about the silence felt dense, almost physical. Sound behaved strangely in that house. My footsteps seemed to echo longer than they should, and occasionally I caught myself listening for something I couldn't identify. When I moved from room to room, I had the persistent sensation that I was being observed, not by anyone present, but by the space itself. The uneven spot in the living room carpet drew my attention repeatedly. Each time I passed over it, I felt that subtle rise beneath my feet. I knelt and pressed my palm against the fibers, trying to determine what might be causing the irregularity. The carpet was thick, expensive, the kind that would show any disturbance. But this wasn't damage, it was something underneath, something that created just enough displacement to be noticeable. I found myself returning to that spot throughout the day. Each time it felt slightly different. Sometimes the rise seemed more pronounced, other times barely detectable. I began to wonder if I was imagining it, if the repetitive nature of my work was creating false sensations. But my hands knew the difference between real and imagined, and this was real. The scent of lemon polish gradually gave way to something else, something I couldn't quite place. Not unpleasant, but unfamiliar. It reminded me of earth after rain, of closed spaces that had been opened after long confinement. I checked the windows all sealed tight. I examined the basement door locked with no key in sight. Yet the smell persisted, growing stronger as the day progressed. In the kitchen, I discovered that the refrigerator was still running, humming quietly in the background. Inside, I found food that hadn't expired, milk that was still fresh, leftovers wrapped in clear containers with dates written in careful handwriting. This wasn't the contents of an abandoned house. This was someone's active, ongoing life. I called the cleaning service. The woman who answered spoke in the same professional tone as before, but when I mentioned the fresh food, she paused. She told me the client had been very specific about the cleaning date, had insisted it happen on this particular day. When I asked how long the house had been empty, she said she'd assumed I already knew the details. But I didn't know the details. I knew only what I'd been told. Clean the house, don't ask questions, leave everything exactly as I found it except for the dust. As afternoon light slanted through the windows, casting long shadows across the rooms, I began to notice other inconsistencies. The prescription bottles in the bathroom were dated recently, some with pills still inside. The newspapers stacked beside the front door were current, delivered within the past week. The answering machine blinked with unheard messages. This wasn't an abandoned house. This was an interrupted life. I started to feel a strange doubling in my perception. The logical part of my mind cataloged what I saw, a clean, well-maintained home where someone had temporarily stepped away. But underneath that rational assessment, another understanding was forming. Something had happened in this house. Something that required careful cleaning, careful attention to details, careful removal of any trace that someone like me had been there. The carpet in the living room began to feel different under my feet, not just uneven, but soft in a way that didn't match the rest of the surface. When I knelt to examine it more closely, I noticed that this section seemed newer than the surrounding area, the fibers slightly different in texture and sheen. It was as if a piece had been replaced, matched as closely as possible, but not perfectly. My hands began to shake as I worked, not from fear exactly, but from a growing sense that I was participating in something I didn't understand. The cleaning wasn't about dust and neglect. It was about erasing evidence, removing traces, preparing a scene. But preparing it for what? The shadows in the room seemed to shift independently of the light. I would glance up from my work to find them in different positions, as if they were rearranging themselves when I wasn't looking. The sensation of being watched intensified, but it was no longer the house observing me. It felt like someone else, someone who had been here recently, someone who might still be here. I found myself moving more quietly, trying not to disturb whatever presence lingered in those rooms. My breathing became shallow, my movements deliberate. I was no longer cleaning, I was intruding. In the bedroom, I noticed that the bed was made with hospital corners, the kind of precision that spoke of military training or institutional experience. But the pillow still held a slight depression, as if someone had slept there recently. I pressed my palm against the mattress and felt a warmth that seemed impossible given how long the house had supposedly been empty. The bathroom mirror reflected my face back to me, but for a moment I didn't recognize myself. My expression looked guilty, complicit, as if I were already keeping secrets I didn't know I possessed. Behind my reflection, the shower curtain hung in perfect folds, but I was certain I hadn't arranged it that way. As the day wore on, I began to understand that there were two versions of reality operating simultaneously in that house. One was the version I could document, the clean rooms, the organized belongings, the evidence of recent habitation. The other was the version I could feel, the weight of concealment, the careful staging, the sense that every surface I claimed was hiding something crucial. The uneven spot in the carpet became the center of both realities. In the logical version, it was simply a minor imperfection, perhaps caused by furniture placement or normal wear. In the other version, it was a marker, a sign, a place where something significant had occurred and been covered over. I spent the final hour of my work moving between these two understandings, unable to settle on either one. Every surface I touched seemed to vibrate with hidden information. Every room I entered felt like a stage set, perfectly arranged to suggest normalcy while concealing something else entirely. When I finished, the house looked exactly as it had when I arrived, only cleaner. I had done my job, I had asked no questions, I had disturbed nothing except the dust. But as I prepared to leave, I realized I had no idea what I was leaving behind. The house felt different now, not because of my cleaning, but because of my presence in it. I had become part of whatever story was unfolding there, whatever truth was being hidden or revealed. I locked the door and replaced the key beneath the ceramic planter. The dried roses crumbled at my touch, leaving dark stains on my fingers that looked like old blood but smelled only of decay. Walking away, I felt the house watching me go, not malevolently, but with a kind of patient expectation, as if it knew I would return. As if it knew that some questions, once asked, demand answers, even when those answers might destroy everything we thought we understood. The cleaning service paid me promptly, just as they'd promised. They thanked me for my discretion and professionalism. They mentioned no future assignments. But sometimes, in the quiet moments between sleep and waking, I feel that uneven rise beneath my feet again. I smell lemon polish mixed with earth and rain. I hear the whisper of footsteps on carpet that shouldn't hold any sound at all. And I wonder if I cleaned that house, or if that house cleaned me of something I can never get back. Story 4. I told them I was out running errands. They scribbled a note, eyes moving to the next question. The air, though, seemed caught in a standstill, heavy with the scent of burnt coffee and something metallic. My fingers, slightly trembling, brushed the residue of powder from my jacket sleeve. The clock ticked loudly, each second dragging on with an accusing rhythm. A streak of something dark marked my shoe, a silent testament woven into the carpet's fibers. They never asked, and I kept my smile steady. But the truth clung to my skin like a second layer. The whole thing was straightforward, really. A simple misunderstanding that spiraled beyond anyone's control. I knew exactly what had happened because I'd been there from the beginning, watching it unfold with the kind of clarity that only comes when you're standing at the center of chaos. She'd been acting strange for weeks, coming home late, avoiding eye contact during dinner, taking phone calls in the other room with hushed voices that stopped the moment I entered. The signs were all there, painted in broad strokes across our daily routine. I'm not the type to ignore obvious patterns, not when they're happening right under my nose. That morning started like any other. Coffee brewing, newspaper folded on the counter, the familiar sounds of suburbia waking up outside our kitchen window. She sat across from me, stirring sugar into her mug with mechanical precision, her gaze fixed somewhere past my shoulder. The silence between us had weight to it, the kind that builds over time until it becomes its own presence in the room. I asked her about her plans for the day. Standard question, standard response. She mentioned meeting a friend, running some errands, maybe stopping by the library. Her voice carried that practiced casualness people use when they're reciting a prepared script. I nodded, folded my paper, and watched her gather her things with the efficiency of someone eager to leave. After she left, I sat in that kitchen for another 20 minutes, listening to the house settle around me. The refrigerator hummed, the heating system clicked on and off. Outside, a neighbor started their lawn mower, the engine catching and roaring to life. Normal sounds for a normal morning, except nothing felt normal anymore. I decided to follow her. Not because I'm the jealous type, you understand, I'm methodical. When something doesn't add up, I investigate until it does. She'd given me enough inconsistencies over the past month to justify a little reconnaissance. The friend she claimed to meet didn't exist in any of her usual circles. The errands never seemed to produce any evidence of actual shopping. And the library story fell apart when I noticed she hadn't checked out a book in over a year. The powder on my jacket came from the construction site where I eventually tracked her down. They were renovating the old department store on the edge of town, the one that had been empty for years. Dust everywhere, coating every surface with a fine gray film that stuck to your clothes and got under your fingernails. I'd brushed against a pile of drywall compound while positioning myself to get a clear view through the chain-link fence. She was inside, talking to a man I'd never seen before. Tall, wearing a hard hat and work boots, gesturing with his hands as he explained something to her. They stood close together, closer than strangers would stand, and when he placed his hand on her shoulder, she didn't pull away. That's when everything clicked into place. The late nights, the secretive phone calls, the elaborate stories about her daily activities. She was having an affair with a construction worker, meeting him at his job site during lunch breaks when the other workers were gone. The evidence was right there in front of me, undeniable and complete. I watched them for maybe 15 minutes, long enough to see him kiss her forehead before she left through a side entrance I hadn't noticed. She walked quickly to her car, checking her phone as she went, probably calculating how much time she had before she needed to be home to maintain her cover story. The dark streak on my shoe happened when I was leaving. I'd been so focused on what I'd witnessed that I wasn't paying attention to where I stepped. The construction site had puddles everywhere from a recent rain, mixed with motor oil and other fluids that had leaked from the heavy machinery. I tracked it all the way to my car without realizing it, only noticing the stain later when I was sitting in that interview room, trying to explain my whereabouts. But here's the thing that's been bothering me since. When they asked me to account for my time that day, I told them about the errands because that's what I'd planned to say if she asked. I'd worked out the whole story beforehand, a list of places I could have been that would explain any gaps in my timeline. The hardware store, the bank, the grocery store, places with security cameras and receipts and witnesses who might remember seeing me. Except I hadn't actually gone to any of those places. I'd spent the entire afternoon following my wife to a construction site, watching her meet with another man, then driving around afterward trying to process what I'd seen. None of which I could explain without admitting that I'd been spying on her, that our marriage had deteriorated to the point where I felt justified in tracking her movements like some kind of private investigator. So I lied, simple as that. I told them I'd been running errands, and they wrote it down without question. They seemed more interested in other details anyway, things I couldn't quite understand the relevance of. The condition of my clothes, whether I'd noticed anything unusual about the neighborhood, if I'd seen any unfamiliar vehicles parked on our street. The metallic smell in that interview room reminded me of something, but I couldn't place it at first. It wasn't until I was driving home that it hit me. The construction site had smelled the same way, not just the dust and machinery, but something sharper underneath, like copper pennies left in the rain or the taste you get in your mouth when you bite your tongue. I'd assumed it was just industrial odors, the byproduct of cutting metal and welding and all the other processes that go into renovating a building. Construction sites always smell like that, don't they? All rust and oil and heated metal mixing together into something that catches in the back of your throat. But now, sitting in my car outside the police station, I started wondering if there might have been another explanation for that smell. And once that thought took hold, other details began shifting in my memory like puzzle pieces rearranging themselves into a different picture. The man she'd been talking to, for instance. I'd been so focused on the intimacy of their interaction that I hadn't paid much attention to his appearance beyond the basics. Tall, wearing work clothes, standing close to my wife, but thinking back, there had been something odd about his posture, the way he'd leaned against a concrete pillar as if he needed the support. And her behavior afterward. She'd left quickly, yes, but not with the satisfied air of someone who just spent time with a lover. There had been something urgent about her movements, almost frantic. She checked her phone multiple times in the space of a few seconds, and when she got to her car, she looked back at the building with an expression I couldn't quite read from my position behind the fence. The timeline was bothering me too. I'd followed her there around noon, expecting to catch her in some romantic rendezvous during a lunch break. But the construction site had been eerily quiet, no signs of active work happening anywhere on the property. No other vehicles in the parking area, no sounds of machinery or workers calling to each other. Just my wife and this one man, standing in what looked like an empty building. When I got home that afternoon, she was already there, sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of tea growing cold in front of her. She looked up when I came in, and for just a moment I saw something in her eyes that I'd never seen before. Not guilt, which is what I'd expected after witnessing her apparent affair. This was something else entirely, something that made my stomach clench with a feeling I couldn't name. She asked me how my day had been, the same question she asked every afternoon, but her voice sounded different. Strained, like she was forcing the words through a throat that didn't want to cooperate. I gave her my prepared answer about errands and mundane tasks, watching her face for signs that she knew I was lying. Instead, she just nodded and went back to staring at her tea. Her hands were wrapped around the mug as if she was trying to absorb its warmth, but I noticed her fingers were trembling slightly. The same kind of tremor I'd developed by the time I was sitting in that interview room, answering questions about my whereabouts and trying not to think about the implications of why they were asking. That night she went to bed early without saying much beyond the usual pleasantries. I stayed up, ostensibly watching television, but really just sitting in the dark, trying to make sense of what I'd seen and how it connected to the growing certainty that something was very wrong. The house felt different somehow, as if the walls themselves were holding secrets that pressed against my consciousness whenever I let my guard down. I kept thinking about that construction worker, the way he'd touched her shoulder, the strange intimacy of their conversation in that empty building. But the more I replayed the scene in my memory, the less certain I became about what I'd actually witnessed. Had it really looked like a romantic encounter, or had I imposed that interpretation because it's what I'd expected to find? The kiss I thought I'd seen, for example. Looking back, it might have been something else entirely. A whispered conversation, maybe, or him leaning down to hear something she was saying. The lighting inside the building had been poor, filtered through dusty windows and construction debris, and I'd been watching from a significant distance through a chain-link fence. And there was something else, something that had been nagging at the edges of my consciousness since that afternoon, but that I'd been reluctant to examine too closely. The man's clothes hadn't looked quite right for someone actively working construction. Clean, for one thing, without the expected stains, and wear patterns you'd see on someone who spent their days handling building materials and operating machinery. More troubling was the growing realization that I might not have been the only one doing surveillance that day. Twice during my drive home, I'd noticed the same dark sedan in my rearview mirror, staying just far enough back to avoid being obvious, but close enough that I started to wonder if it was following me. When I'd pulled into a gas station to test the theory, the car had continued past without stopping, but something about the way the driver had kept their face turned away from my direction had left me unsettled. By the time the police showed up at my door 3 days later, I'd convinced myself that my paranoia was just a natural response to the stress of discovering my wife's infidelity. People imagine conspiracies when their personal world starts falling apart, I told myself. It's a way of imposing order on chaos, of finding external explanations for internal turmoil. But sitting in that interview room, watching the detectives exchange glances when they thought I wasn't looking, I started to wonder if my paranoia might have been justified after all. They knew something I didn't, something that made my story about running errands seem either irrelevant or suspicious. The questions they asked suggested they were working from a timeline I wasn't privy to, trying to account for movements and actions that went far beyond my simple domestic drama. The powder on my jacket, which I'd assumed was just construction dust, had drawn more attention than seemed warranted. One of the detectives had asked if I'd been near any renovation projects recently, if I'd had occasion to handle building materials or visit construction sites. I'd said no, of course, because admitting otherwise would have required explaining why I'd been spying on my wife. But now I'm wondering what they might have found if I'd told them the truth, whether that powder was really just drywall compound, or if it might have been something else entirely. Something that would explain the metallic smell and the strange behavior of everyone involved, and the growing sense that I'd stumbled into the middle of something much more serious than marital infidelity. The dark stain on my shoe had also generated more interest than expected. They'd asked if I could account for how it got there, whether I'd walked through any puddles or stepped in anything unusual. I'd mentioned the rain, the general messiness of being out and about on a wet day, but I could see they weren't entirely satisfied with my explanation. What I didn't tell them was that the stain hadn't washed out, even after multiple attempts with different cleaning products. Whatever I'd stepped in had bonded with the leather in a way that suggested it wasn't just ordinary mud or water. There was something persistent about it, something that resisted removal and left a faint odor that reminded me of that construction site every time I caught a whiff. My wife hasn't been home since the day they interviewed me. Her absence might be connected to their investigation, or it might be coincidence, but either way, the house feels hollow without her presence. I keep expecting to hear her key in the lock, her footsteps on the stairs, the familiar sounds of her evening routine. Instead, there's just silence and the growing weight of questions I can't answer. I've driven past the construction site twice since then, but both times it's been completely deserted. No workers, no equipment, no signs of ongoing renovation. The building looks exactly the same as it did when I followed her there, except now it seems more ominous somehow, as if it's holding secrets that extend far beyond whatever I witnessed between my wife and that mysterious man. The truth is, I'm no longer certain what I saw that day, or what it means, or how it connects to the questions the police were asking. The neat narrative I'd constructed about infidelity and deception has started to crumble under the weight of details that don't fit, inconsistencies that suggest a much more complex and troubling reality. And sitting here now in this empty house, with the taste of copper pennies lingering in my mouth and the smell of that construction site clinging to my clothes despite multiple washings, I'm beginning to suspect that the person I should have been investigating all along wasn't my wife. It was myself, story 5. The hum of fluorescent lights cast a sterile glow over the late-night grocery store, where aisles stood empty and shelves brimmed with untouched goods. A faint aroma of citrus and cleaner tinged the air, mingling with the plastic chill of refrigerated sections. In the produce aisle, a single apple rolled unprompted across the polished floor, stopping with a soft thud against my shoe. Every instinct told me to leave, yet I found myself rooted in place, watching the shadows dance against the baskets. I bent down to pick up the apple, red delicious, though the skin showed bruises that hadn't been there moments before when I'd watched it roll. The flesh beneath felt soft, yielding under my thumb in a way that made my stomach turn. I set it back on the display, but my hands retained the sensation of that give, that wrongness. The store manager had called me in for what he described as routine questions. A customer had gone missing after shopping here, he'd said. The police wanted to speak with anyone who might have seen something unusual. I'd been working the night shift for months, stocking shelves while the world slept, invisible among the rows of cereal boxes and canned goods. But standing here now, I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd witnessed this scene before. The apple, the way it moved without cause, the particular angle of light cutting across the produce section. My memory felt like a photograph that had been exposed twice, images bleeding into each other until neither seemed entirely real. The manager's office sat behind a wall of one-way glass overlooking the checkout lanes. I'd seen him watching sometimes, a silhouette against the bright rectangle of his window. He told me the missing customer was a woman who'd come in regularly, always buying the same items, always paying in cash. But when I tried to picture her, my mind offered only fragments: a yellow sweater, hands that shook slightly when counting bills, the sound of her cart's wheels, one of which squeaked with each rotation. I walked toward the back of the store, past the pharmacy counter with its security cameras and locked cabinets. The fluorescent lights flickered in a pattern that seemed almost deliberate, as if someone were signaling from above. My footsteps echoed differently here, the sound bouncing off walls lined with employee notices and safety regulations. The break room door stood ajar. Inside, someone had left a cup of coffee on the small table, steam still rising from its surface. The liquid was black, untouched, and when I leaned closer, I caught a scent that didn't match coffee at all. Something sharper, chemical, like the cleaning supplies we used to mop the floors. I'd been in this room countless times during my shifts, eating sandwiches from home and reading paperback novels to pass the quiet hours. But tonight it felt foreign, as if the dimensions had shifted slightly. The clock on the wall showed a time that couldn't be right, though I couldn't say why. My own watch had stopped working, the hands frozen at an angle that looked more like an accusation than a measurement. The manager appeared in the doorway without warning, his presence filling the small space. He wore the same polo shirt and khakis he always wore, but something in his posture suggested a performance, as if he were playing the role of himself. "The detective wants to see you now," he said. His voice carried an undertone I'd never noticed before, a careful modulation that made each word sound rehearsed. I followed him through corridors I thought I knew, past storage rooms and loading docks. But we took turns that didn't align with my mental map of the building. The walls seemed to close in as we walked, and I found myself focusing on the back of his neck, where a small scar formed a crescent shape just below his hairline. The detective waited in what appeared to be another office, though I couldn't remember ever seeing this room before. She sat behind a metal desk, her hands folded over a manila folder that looked thin for an investigation file. When she spoke, her questions felt routine, almost bored. Had I noticed anything unusual? Did I remember the missing customer? Had anyone else been in the store that night? But as I answered, my own voice sounded strange to me, as if the words were coming from someone else's mouth. I heard myself describing things I wasn't sure I'd actually seen. The woman in the yellow sweater buying milk and bread, a man in a dark coat who'd lingered too long in the pharmacy section. The way the automatic doors had malfunctioned, opening and closing without anyone approaching. The detective wrote nothing down. She simply watched me speak, her eyes holding an expression I couldn't read. When I finished, she closed the empty folder and thanked me for my time. The manager escorted me back through the same impossible corridors, and I found myself standing once again in the produce section. The apple was gone from where I'd placed it. In its spot sat a different piece of fruit, an orange that looked exactly like all the others in the display but somehow felt significant. I picked it up, and the skin was warm despite the refrigerated air. Underneath, I could feel something hard and angular, as if someone had hidden an object inside the fruit itself. My shift was supposed to end soon, but I couldn't remember when it had started. The time cards by the employee entrance showed punches that didn't match my memory. According to the machine, I'd been here much longer than seemed possible, working hours that blended together into a continuous present. I began walking the aisles systematically, looking for something I couldn't name. In the cereal section, boxes had been rearranged to spell out letters, though the message, if there was one, remained unclear. The frozen food cases hummed at frequencies that seemed to penetrate my bones. Near the bakery, the smell of fresh bread mingled with something else, something organic and unsettling. The security cameras tracked my movement with mechanical precision. I'd grown used to their presence during my months of night work, but now I wondered who watched the recordings. The manager had mentioned reviewing footage, but I'd never seen him do it. The monitors in his office always showed empty aisles, static shots of nothing happening. I returned to the break room, drawn by a need I couldn't articulate. The coffee cup was gone, but its absence felt more significant than its presence had. On the bulletin board, among the usual notices about health insurance and vacation policies, someone had pinned a photograph I'd never seen before. It showed the store's exterior at night, but from an impossible angle, as if taken from high above or far away. In the photo, light spilled from the windows in patterns that didn't match the store's actual layout. There were too many windows or too few. The parking lot contained cars that looked decades old, models I didn't recognize. And standing near the entrance, barely visible in the grainy image, was a figure in a yellow sweater. I studied the photograph until my eyes watered, trying to make sense of its details. The longer I looked, the more the image seemed to shift, like an optical illusion that revealed different shapes depending on how you focused. The figure by the entrance might have been a person, or a shadow, or a trick of the light. The store's public address system crackled to life, though no voice followed, just static, punctuated by sounds that might have been breathing or might have been the building settling. I walked to the customer service counter where the microphone sat, but the equipment showed no signs of recent use. Behind the counter, in a drawer that should have been locked, I found a stack of receipts held together with a rubber band. They were all from the same night, all showing purchases of identical items: milk, bread, and apples. The time stamps were minutes apart, but the customer signatures at the bottom were all different, each one a variation of handwriting that looked almost but not quite the same. The last receipt in the stack was blank except for a single line item: payment pending. The signature line remained empty, waiting for a name that would never come. I thought about the woman in the yellow sweater, trying to construct a complete picture from the fragments in my memory, but each time I focused on a detail, it seemed to change. Her hair was blonde, then brown, then gray. She was young, then middle-aged, then elderly. She smiled when she paid, or she frowned, or her expression was completely neutral. The truth was, I couldn't be certain she'd ever existed at all. The fluorescent lights began to flicker in earnest now, casting the store in alternating brightness and shadow. In those moments of darkness, I glimpsed movement in my peripheral vision, shapes that vanished when the light returned. The automatic doors opened and closed in rhythm with the flickering, as if the building itself were breathing. I made my way toward the exit, but the distance seemed to stretch with each step. The aisles extended beyond their normal boundaries, shelves repeating in patterns that defied the store's actual dimensions. Products I'd stocked appeared and disappeared, replaced by items I didn't recognize, brands that looked familiar but wrong, like words in a language I almost understood. At the checkout lanes, the registers displayed totals for transactions that had never occurred. Numbers climbed and fell without human input, calculating the cost of purchases no one had made. The receipt paper spilled onto the floor in long, unbroken streams, covered with text too faint to read. I reached for the door handle, but my reflection in the glass showed someone I didn't immediately recognize. The face was mine, but altered in subtle ways. The eyes were darker or lighter. The mouth was set in an expression I'd never worn. Behind my reflection, the store stretched into impossible depths, filled with customers who cast no shadows and employees who moved without purpose. The door opened with a sound like breaking glass, though the surface remained intact. Outside, the parking lot was empty except for my car, which sat under a streetlight that hadn't been working when I'd arrived. The light cast everything in amber tones that made the familiar look foreign. I sat behind the wheel but didn't start the engine. In the rearview mirror, the store looked exactly as it always had, ordinary and unremarkable. The windows glowed with steady fluorescent light, revealing aisles stocked with everyday products. Nothing moved inside. Nothing seemed out of place. But on the passenger seat beside me lay an apple, red and perfect, with no sign of the bruises I remembered. When I picked it up, it felt solid and real, cool to the touch. Normal in every way except for the small sticker on its surface, which bore not a price or product code, but a single word written in handwriting I almost recognized: remember. I drove home through streets that seemed wider than usual, past houses where every window was dark. The radio played static, punctuated by fragments of voices speaking words I couldn't quite catch. When I finally reached my apartment, I placed the apple on the kitchen counter and went to bed, though sleep felt impossible. But I must have slept because I woke to sunlight streaming through windows I didn't remember opening. The apple was gone from the counter. In its place sat a newspaper folded to an article about a missing person case. The photograph showed a woman in a yellow sweater, smiling at the camera. The caption identified her as a local resident who disappeared after a routine shopping trip. I read the article twice, then a third time. The details matched what the manager had told me, but they also contradicted my memory in ways I couldn't pinpoint. The woman's age was different, or her description, or the date she'd gone missing. Each reading revealed new inconsistencies, as if the text were rewriting itself. The phone rang and the manager's voice asked if I could come in early for my next shift. There were more questions, he said. The investigation was ongoing. I agreed, though I couldn't remember what shift I was supposed to work or when it was scheduled to begin. When I returned to the store, everything looked exactly as it should. The produce section was fully stocked, apples arranged in perfect pyramids. The fluorescent lights hummed steadily overhead. Other employees moved through their routines with practiced efficiency, and customers filled their carts with ordinary purchases. But in the break room, the photograph on the bulletin board had changed. The same impossible angle, the same distorted lighting, but now the figure in the yellow sweater stood closer to the camera. Close enough that I could see her face, though her features seemed to shift each time I looked away and back. I began my shift, stocking shelves and helping customers, performing the same tasks I'd done for months. But underneath the routine, I felt the weight of questions I couldn't answer. Had I seen something I'd forgotten? Had I failed to notice something important? Or was I remembering things that had never happened at all? The apple in my apartment had been real. The photograph on the bulletin board was real. But the space between these facts contained only uncertainty, a gap where truth should have been but wasn't. As the night wore on and the store emptied of customers, I found myself walking the same route I'd taken before, past the pharmacy, through the break room, along aisles that seemed both familiar and strange. The security cameras followed my movement, recording everything and nothing, preserving images that might mean something or might mean nothing at all. In the produce section, I stopped where the apple had rolled against my shoe. The floor was clean and unmarked, polished to a shine that reflected the fluorescent lights above. I stood there for a long time, waiting for something to happen, but nothing did. The store remained exactly what it appeared to be. A place where people bought things they needed, where employees worked their shifts and went home, where the ordinary business of life continued without mystery or meaning. But somewhere in the space between what I remembered and what I could prove, a woman in a yellow sweater continued to exist, neither present nor absent, neither found nor lost. And I remained the only witness to her impossible presence, carrying the weight of a truth I couldn't verify and couldn't forget. The fluorescent lights hummed their endless song, and I listened, waiting for the moment when their rhythm might reveal something I needed to know. But that moment never came, and perhaps it never would. Story 6. The latch didn't click into place. My fingertips brushed over it, expecting the familiar resistance, but found only stillness. I pushed the door wider, the hinges releasing a soundless yawn. Inside, the room lay undisturbed, yet something shivered beneath the surface. The old fan spun lazily above, its usual hum replaced by an odd emptiness that seemed to seep into my bones. Shadows refused to retreat, clinging tightly to corners. As I reached for the switch, I felt the air thicken, a sensation more solid than darkness itself. In the dim light, every object held its breath, as if waiting for something to break the spell. My skin brushed against the fabric of the chair, but it refused to yield. It wasn't the chair I remembered. The blue thread, that's what keeps coming back to me. A single thread frayed at the edges, caught on something sharp. I can see it clearly when I close my eyes, but the rest dissolves like smoke. Was it from a shirt, a curtain? The more I reach for the memory, the more it slips away, leaving only that blue thread suspended in darkness. I remember standing in that doorway before, or maybe I dreamed it. The distinction has become meaningless now. The fan was spinning then too, but the sound was different, heavier, like breathing. You left it open again. The voice comes from nowhere, from everywhere. I can't tell if someone spoke or if the words simply materialized in the stale air. They feel familiar, worn smooth by repetition, but I can't place the speaker. The tone carried something I should recognize: disappointment, fear. My hands shake when I try to remember whose voice it was. The fabric under my palm feels wrong, too smooth, too cold. This chair used to be rough, textured like sandpaper against skin. I used to sit here and feel the weave catch on my clothes, leaving tiny pulls in sweaters. Now it's slick, almost wet, though my fingers come away dry. There was someone else in this room once. I can feel the impression they left behind, like a body-shaped depression in a mattress. The air still holds their presence, thick and cloying. But when I try to focus on who it was, the image fractures into pieces too small to reassemble. Blue thread, always the blue thread. The switch clicks under my finger, but the light that floods the room feels artificial, borrowed from somewhere else. It doesn't belong here. Nothing belongs here anymore, including me. I'm an intruder in my own memory, stumbling through scenes I should know by heart. The fan blade catches the light wrong. There's something dark on one edge, a stain that wasn't there before. Or was it? My memory keeps rewriting itself, painting over the truth with layers of doubt. The stain could be rust, could be something else, could be nothing at all. You always forget to close it. There it is again, that voice without a face. The words carry weight like stones dropped into still water. They mean something important, something I've been avoiding. The door behind me stands open, but I don't remember leaving it that way. The latch hangs loose, broken, or deliberately damaged. I think someone was hurt here. The thought comes unbidden, unwelcome. I push it away, but it clings like the shadows in the corners. Someone was hurt, and I was supposed to prevent it. Or maybe I was the one who caused it. The distinction blurs when I try to examine it closely. My reflection in the window shows a stranger's face. Hollow eyes, pale skin stretched too tight over sharp bones. This isn't how I remember looking. This isn't how I remember anything. The blue thread dances in my peripheral vision, always just out of reach. When I turn to look directly, it vanishes, leaving only empty air and the taste of copper on my tongue. There was blood somewhere, not here, not in this room, but close enough to seep through the walls. I can smell it beneath the mustiness, metallic and sweet. It doesn't belong to me, but somehow I'm connected to it, responsible for it. The chair groans when I sit, though I don't remember moving toward it. The fabric clings to my skin like it's trying to hold me in place. This is where I was sitting when it happened, whatever it was. The memory hovers just beyond consciousness, a shape in the fog that refuses to solidify. Why didn't you lock the door? The question hangs in the air like an accusation. I should know the answer. I should remember why the latch is broken, why the door swings open at the slightest touch. But the knowledge has been scraped away, leaving only raw confusion behind. Someone trusted me to keep them safe. The certainty hits like a physical blow, doubling me over in the chair. Someone relied on me, and I failed them. The blue thread is proof of that failure, evidence of something torn apart that should have remained whole. The fan spins faster now, or maybe that's just my imagination. The stain on the blade seems to pulse with each rotation, a dark heartbeat against the pale ceiling. I want to look away, but my eyes are drawn to it like metal filings to a magnet. I think I used to sleep in this room. The bed is gone now, but I can see its outline in the carpet, 4 rectangular depressions where the legs once stood. I remember lying there in the dark, listening to footsteps in the hall outside, waiting for the door to open. But I also remember standing in the hallway, my hand on that broken latch, afraid to enter. The memories contradict each other, impossible to reconcile. Was I the one inside or the one outside? Was I waiting or approaching? The blue thread appears again, this time caught on the door frame at eye level. When I reach for it, my fingers pass through empty air. It's not really there, but it's not really gone either. It exists in the space between memory and reality, a bridge I'm afraid to cross. You promised you'd remember. The voice is clearer now, tinged with sadness that cuts deeper than anger ever could. I did promise. The words come back to me in fragments, scattered across conversations I can barely recall. I swore I would never forget, never let the truth disappear into the convenient darkness of selective memory. But forgetting is easier than remembering. Forgetting doesn't leave you sitting in empty rooms, staring at stains on sailing fans and chasing phantom threads through the air. The light flickers, casting dancing shadows that seem to move independently of their sources. In those brief moments of darkness, I glimpse other versions of this room. Furniture in different arrangements, walls painted different colors, a window where now there's only blank plaster. Which version is real? Which one am I sitting in now? The chair beneath me shifts, its texture changing from moment to moment. Sometimes it's the rough fabric I remember, sometimes the smooth coldness that feels like skin. Sometimes it's not a chair at all, but something else entirely, something that shouldn't be in this room. I close my eyes and try to reconstruct the sequence of events. There was a sound first, I think, a crash or a cry, something that brought me running. The door was already open when I arrived, the latch hanging broken and useless. But that doesn't align with the other memory, the one where I'm the one approaching, the one who should have locked the door behind me. The blue thread stretches between these contradictory versions like a lifeline. It's the only constant, the only detail that remains unchanged no matter how many times I replay the scene. But what does it mean? What was torn? What was lost? Blood on the walls, but only in my peripheral vision. When I look directly, there's nothing but faded paint and water stains. The smell remains, though metallic and persistent. It's strongest near the door, as if someone stood there bleeding while I sat in this chair, watching. Or maybe I was the one standing. Maybe I was the one blighting. The fan blade completes another rotation, and the stain catches the light differently this time. It's not rust, it's not nothing. It's exactly what I've been afraid to acknowledge, the piece of evidence that ties all these fragments together into a truth I'm not ready to face. You could have prevented this. Yes, the word forms in my throat but never reaches my lips. I could have prevented it. I should have prevented it. The broken latch, the open door, the blue thread caught on something sharp, they're all markers of my failure, breadcrumbs leading back to a moment when I made the wrong choice. Or maybe the right choice. Maybe that's what makes it so hard to remember. The room grows smaller as I sit here, the walls pressing inward like a closing fist. The shadows deepen despite the artificial light, reaching toward me with fingers made of regret and suppressed knowledge. I want to leave, but my legs won't respond. The chair holds me like quicksand, patient and inescapable. Someone screamed, the memory surfaces without warning, sharp and immediate. A voice raised in terror or pain, cut short by something I refuse to identify. The sound echoed off these walls, absorbed into the plaster and wood grain, waiting to be released by the right combination of guilt and recognition. Was it my voice? The question terrifies me more than any answer could. The blue thread appears one final time, no longer dancing but hanging motionless in the center of the room. It's longer now, stretching from floor to ceiling like a plumb line marking the exact spot where everything went wrong. I reach for it with trembling fingers, and this time it doesn't disappear. The texture is exactly as I remember, soft cotton worn thin by handling, frayed at the edges where it was torn from something larger. A shirt, maybe, or a curtain that should have been drawn, should have provided the privacy that might have changed everything. As my fingers close around the thread, the room shifts one final time. The chair beneath me becomes what it always was. The walls resume their true positions, and the stain on the fan blade reveals itself in all its terrible clarity. The door swings shut behind me with a soft click, the latch finally finding its mark. But I'm on the wrong side now. I'm inside when I should be outside, or outside when I should be inside. The blue thread dissolves in my grasp, leaving only the echo of its presence and the growing certainty that some truths are too heavy to carry. The fan spins on, patient and persistent, marking time that no longer has meaning. In its rhythm, I hear the voice again, clearer now than ever before. You left it open again. And I know with the crystalline clarity that comes only in nightmares that I always will. Story 7. On Mondays, the phone would ring 5 times before the answering machine clicked on, a familiar interruption in the daily hum. It was a pattern I had come to expect, marking the start of another week. Yet last week I noticed the 6th ring a muffled echo followed by a pause, as if the call lingered longer than usual. I dismissed it then as a minor glitch, a delay in the wires. But today the sequence shifted again, with the phone ringing an odd 4 times, each note hanging uncertainly in the air. And this morning the machine never clicked, leaving the line open and silent. I told myself it was just a coincidence, but the unease in my chest suggests otherwise. The coffee grows cold while I stare at the receiver. Black plastic, ordinary as breathing, yet somehow different now, changed. The silence stretches between us like a held breath, and I wonder if someone is listening on the other end, waiting for me to speak first. I remember her hands, small, precise movements as she adjusted the settings on my machine that afternoon she came to help organize my office. She said the delay was too long, that callers would hang up before leaving messages. Important calls, she insisted, business calls I couldn't afford to miss. The adjustment was simple, a tiny dial behind the unit, barely visible unless you knew where to look. But the calls never came for business. There's a notebook I keep by the phone now, filled with tallies and times, not because I plan to document anything, but because patterns demand recognition. Monday, 5 rings. Tuesday, 5 rings. Wednesday, none at all. The silence on Wednesday felt different than the silence today, expectant rather than empty. I should mention the footprints in the garden soil, partial impressions near the window that faces my desk where the phone sits. The size suggests someone smaller than me, someone who might have stood there watching as I worked late into the evening, the lamp casting my shadow against the glass. The police officer who came to file the report had tired eyes and coffee breath. He wrote down what I told him about the calls, the patterns, the subtle wrongness that had settled over my routine like dust. but when I mentioned the footprints, he looked past me toward the garden with the expression of someone who had heard this story before. "Could be the mail carrier," he said, "or a neighbor's cat disturbing the soil." I didn't tell him about the adjustment to my answering machine. It seemed too small a detail, too intimate a violation to explain to a stranger. Some discoveries feel too fragile for official reports. The thing about patterns is how they change you. Before the calls, I moved through my house without thinking about sight lines or vulnerable windows. Now I notice how the kitchen light illuminates my movements for anyone standing in the right spot outside, how the bathroom window lacks a proper curtain, how many moments of my life have been visible to watching eyes without my knowledge. She knew these things about my house. During her visit, she commented on the natural light, how open everything felt. Like living in a fishbowl, she said, but her tone suggested admiration rather than concern. I've been thinking about that phrase, fishbowl, the way fish move in circles, unaware of the watching faces pressed against the glass. The calls stopped for 3 days after I changed my routine. I started working in the back room, away from windows, and unplugged the phone during the hours I'd noticed the patterns most clearly. The silence felt like victory until I realized silence could mean many things. On the 4th day, I found my garbage had been disturbed, not scattered or torn, but carefully searched. Items repositioned with an attention to detail that suggested familiarity with my habits. The coffee filters I'd thrown away were folded differently than I remembered. A receipt had been smoothed flat, as if someone had studied the purchase details. The receipt was for a new deadbolt. I'd bought it the morning after the police visit, along with window locks and a motion sensor light for the garden. Small precautions that felt reasonable in daylight but seemed inadequate once darkness settled over the house. I installed the deadbolt myself, though the instructions warned about proper alignment and professional installation. The mechanism felt solid under my fingers, substantial enough to matter. But locks only work if you remember to use them, and memory becomes unreliable when routine dissolves into hypervigilance. The night I forgot to engage the deadbolt, I woke to the sound of my own voice on the answering machine. Not a recording I remembered making. My voice, but saying words I'd never spoken, discussing plans I'd never made. The message was brief, casual, as if I were confirming arrangements with a friend. But I have no friends who call at that hour, no arrangements that would require such confirmation. I played the message 17 times before erasing it, trying to identify some flaw that would prove it wasn't really my voice. The inflection was right, the slight hesitation before certain words, even the way I cleared my throat at the end, an unconscious habit I didn't know I possessed until I heard it played back. The machine's display showed no record of an outgoing call. During her visit, she'd asked about my work schedule, whether I traveled, whether anyone checked on me regularly. Questions that seemed like polite conversation then, but feel different now, weighted with purpose I couldn't have recognized at the time. I told her about the predictability of my routine, how I valued consistency, the comfort of knowing what each day would bring. She nodded with what I interpreted as understanding, but perhaps it was something else entirely. Perhaps it was planning. The police officer's card sits on my desk next to the notebook of tallies. His name printed in block letters below the department logo, along with a direct number and extension. I've dialed the first 3 digits several times, but never completed the call. What would I report? That someone might have used my voice to leave a message on my own machine, that my garbage was searched by someone with careful hands. Evidence requires proof, and proof requires witnesses. In the space between suspicion and certainty, I've become my own unreliable narrator. The calls resumed with a different pattern. 7 rings now, followed by a pause so long I begin to think the caller has disconnected, then an 8th ring that seems to echo from somewhere else in the house. I've checked every phone, every extension, but the source of that final ring remains elusive. Last night I dreamed about her hands again, not adjusting the machine this time, but dialing numbers with practiced precision. In the dream, she was calling me from inside my own house, standing in rooms I couldn't see, speaking in my voice to people I'd never met. I woke to find my notebook open to a page I didn't remember writing. The handwriting looked like mine, but the words described observations I'd never made, details about my neighbors' schedules and habits that suggested surveillance I'd never conducted. The ink was still wet. Perhaps I should mention that she never gave me her full name. During the visit, she introduced herself with only a first name and a vague connection to the mutual acquaintance who'd recommended her services. I didn't think to ask for references or identification. Her knowledge of organizational systems seemed genuine, her suggestions practical and immediately helpful. Only later did I realize how little I actually knew about the person I'd allowed into my most private spaces. The motion sensor light in the garden activates at irregular intervals throughout the night. Sometimes I see what triggered it, a cat, a shifting branch, the subtle movement of settling earth. Other times the light reveals only empty space, illuminated for no apparent reason. But empty doesn't mean unoccupied. It only means nothing visible enough to cast a shadow. I've started sleeping in different rooms, changing locations without pattern to confuse anyone who might be tracking my movements. The guest room one night, the living room couch the next. But consistency of location matters less when someone understands the deeper rhythms of your existence. She knew I was a light sleeper. During her visit, I mentioned how easily sounds woke me, how I'd learned to navigate the house in darkness to avoid disturbing my own rest. Information I shared as casual conversation, not realizing how useful such details might become. The phone rang 43 times this morning before I finally answered. No pattern now, just persistence. When I lifted the receiver, I heard only breathing, not heavy or threatening, just the quiet rhythm of someone waiting. "I know you're there," I said. The breathing stopped, but the line remained open. "What do you want?" A sound then barely audible. It might have been my name, whispered in a voice I couldn't identify. Or it might have been nothing more than static, my mind creating meaning where none existed. The line went dead before I could be certain. I've been thinking about certainty lately, how it differs from knowledge, from belief, from the stories we tell ourselves to make sense of incomplete information. The police officer was certain the footprints meant nothing. I'm certain they mean everything, but certainty without proof is just another kind of faith. The notebook now contains 47 pages of observations, patterns, and questions that multiply faster than answers. Reading back through my entries, I notice my handwriting has changed, not dramatically, but subtly. The letters lean differently now, crowded together as if trying to hide from observation. Or perhaps trying to match someone else's natural rhythm. She left no physical evidence of her visit except for the adjusted answering machine and a faint scent that lingered in the office for days afterward. Something floral but synthetic, like air freshener, designed to mask rather than enhance. I bought 3 different room sprays trying to identify the exact fragrance, but none matched my memory. Memory, I've learned, is surprisingly unreliable. Details I thought I remembered clearly prove false when examined closely. The color of her jacket, the specific words of our conversation, even the length of her visit all shift depending on my mood and the quality of light in the room where I'm trying to remember. But some memories resist revision. The careful way she handled my possessions, the questions that seemed random but weren't, the moment she paused by the window, looking out at the garden with the expression of someone memorizing a view. The calls have stopped again, but the silence feels different now, purposeful rather than absent, as if the caller has moved beyond needing to announce their presence. This morning I found my spare key in a different location, not missing, just moved. From the hiding spot I'd used for months to another spot equally concealed, but somehow more convenient for someone approaching from the garden side of the house. I should feel violated by this discovery, but instead I feel oddly relieved. Physical evidence at last, proof that my suspicions have substance beyond paranoia and sleepless nights. The key is warm in my palm as if recently handled. Tomorrow I'll change the locks again, install a security system. Take all the reasonable precautions that should have occurred to me weeks ago, before the patterns became so entrenched, before the watching eyes became part of my daily landscape. But tonight, I think I'll leave the key where I found it and see what happens when someone discovers their access has been noticed but not revoked. The phone sits silent on the desk, its red light blinking steadily in the darkness. Story 8. I stood rooted in place, watching the shadow stretch across the room. It shouldn't have been there. The light source was fixed, unchanging. The walls themselves seemed to breathe, a ripple of movement in the stillness of the night. A clock ticked somewhere, but its rhythm failed to mark the moments accurately too slow or maybe too fast. My ears strained for an anomaly, anything that would break the tension suspended in the air. Then a gust of wind pushed through an unseen gap. Papers on the desk fluttered, but one sheet stayed perfectly still. I knew what had happened in this room. I'd pieced it together months ago, sitting in that sterile conference room while the investigators laid out their findings. The case was straightforward, they said. A break-in gone wrong. The intruder had entered through the back door, surprised the homeowner, and fled when things escalated. The physical evidence supported this narrative completely. Broken glass near the entry point, muddy footprints leading from the door to the desk, a struggle that ended badly. The homeowner had been found face down near the filing cabinet, keys still clutched in one hand. The intruder had clearly been searching for something specific: cash, jewelry, important documents. These crimes followed predictable patterns, the lead detective explained. Random violence born from desperation and opportunity. The neighborhood had seen 3 similar incidents that summer. I accepted this explanation because it made sense, because it fit the evidence, because it allowed me to sleep at night knowing that random tragedy, while terrible, was at least comprehensible. The world operated according to certain rules, and this crime followed those rules perfectly. But standing in that room now, months after the investigation closed, something felt different. The air itself seemed thick with questions I hadn't thought to ask before. The shadow I was watching shouldn't exist, not with the single lamp positioned where it was, yet there it stretched, dark and definite against the far wall. I moved closer to the desk where those papers had fluttered in the wind, all except one. That single sheet remained motionless, as if weighted down by something invisible. When I reached for it, my fingers found nothing unusual, just ordinary paper with ordinary ink. but the way it had stayed still while everything around it moved struck me as wrong somehow. The broken glass near the back door caught the lamplight differently than I remembered from the crime scene photos. In those images, the shards had appeared scattered randomly, the way glass breaks when struck from outside. Now, examining the pattern more carefully, I noticed how some pieces lay closer to the door than others, almost as if they'd been arranged. This thought disturbed me more than it should have. I tried to dismiss it as imagination, the kind of false pattern recognition that happens when you stare at something too long, but the feeling persisted. The glass didn't look random anymore, it looked deliberate. I walked the path the intruder supposedly took from the door to the desk. The floorboards creaked under my weight in places they hadn't creaked before, or maybe I simply hadn't noticed the sounds during my previous visits. The muddy footprints were long gone, cleaned away by the restoration crew, but I tried to remember their exact placement from the photographs. They'd been clear prints, the investigators noted, distinct tread patterns that helped establish the intruder's movements through the house. But as I retraced that path, I realized something odd about those prints. They'd been too clear, too perfect. Mud from outside should have been messier, more smeared. These prints looked almost like they'd been made with fresh mud, applied carefully to create obvious evidence. The filing cabinet where the homeowner was found drew my attention next. Its drawers hung open, contents scattered across the floor in what appeared to be a frantic search. But looking at the mess now, I noticed an underlying organization to the chaos. Important documents lay on top of less significant papers. Valuable items remained easily visible rather than buried beneath the debris. If someone had been searching desperately for something specific, wouldn't they have created genuine disorder? My certainty began to crack along these small inconsistencies. Details that had seemed perfectly logical when viewed through the lens of a random break-in now appeared strange when examined more closely. The crime scene had been almost too clean, too obvious in its narrative structure. Real chaos rarely arranged itself so conveniently. I found myself questioning not just the physical evidence, but my own role in accepting it so readily. Why had I been so quick to embrace the official explanation? What had I needed to believe about this crime that made me overlook these inconsistencies? The homeowner's keys still clutched in death bothered me most of all. The investigators had interpreted this detail as evidence of surprise, proof that the victim had been caught off guard while entering their own home. But Key's clutch that tightly suggested something else entirely. Determination, purpose, the grip of someone who knew exactly what they were doing. I tried to remember everything I knew about the victim. A quiet person, according to neighbors, someone who kept to themselves, maintained their property well, never caused trouble. But this description felt generic, like a template rather than a real portrait of a human being. What did any of us actually know about what happened behind those walls? The wind picked up again, and I heard it moving through the house in ways that seemed impossible. The back door was closed, the windows were sealed, yet air moved through the rooms like the building itself was breathing. I followed the sound, trying to locate its source, but it seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. In the kitchen, I found more details that hadn't registered before. The refrigerator hummed with an irregular rhythm, like a heartbeat with an arrhythmia. Cabinet doors hung slightly ajar, not enough to be obvious, but enough to create thin lines of shadow that changed the room's geometry. A coffee mug sat in the sink, half filled with liquid that had long since grown cold and formed a film across its surface. Had that mug been there during the investigation, I couldn't remember seeing it in any of the crime scene photos, but it looked like it had been sitting there for months, undisturbed by the cleaning crews or investigators, as if it existed in some pocket of time separate from the rest of the house. The more I examined these details, the more I began to suspect that my understanding of the crime was fundamentally flawed, not just incomplete, but actively wrong. The break-in narrative had been constructed from evidence that could support multiple interpretations. I'd chosen to see one story because it was the most comfortable, the most familiar. But what if the homeowner hadn't been surprised by an intruder? What if they'd been expecting someone? What if those keys weren't clutched in fear, but in preparation? The filing cabinet's contents, scattered but organized, suggested someone who knew exactly what they were looking for, someone with intimate knowledge of what the drawers contained. The muddy footprints took on new significance under this interpretation. Not evidence of an outsider's intrusion, but a carefully constructed trail meant to support a specific narrative. The broken glass became not the result of forced entry, but a scene staged to appear that way. Even the timing of the crime aligned with this possibility, occurring when neighbors were likely to be asleep, when witnesses would be scarce. I realized I was no longer thinking about a random break-in gone wrong. I was considering the possibility of something far more deliberate, a crime planned and executed by someone who understood exactly how the evidence would be interpreted. Someone who knew that investigators would see what they expected to see, would construct the most obvious narrative from the available facts. But if this was true, then who was the real victim, and who was the perpetrator? The homeowner's death could have been accidental, the unintended consequence of a plan that went wrong, or it could have been the intended outcome all along, disguised as something else entirely. The person I'd been thinking of as a victim might have been an active participant in whatever happened that night, or they might have been betrayed by someone they trusted. Standing in that breathing house, surrounded by evidence that no longer meant what I thought it meant, I felt my grip on the truth slipping away entirely. The shadow on the wall continued to stretch in impossible directions. The clock continued its irregular rhythm. The papers on the desk stirred in wind that had no source. I began to wonder if I was the intruder now, if my presence in this space was disturbing some delicate balance that had been maintained since that night. The house seemed to be responding to my questions, revealing details that had been hidden before. Or maybe I was simply seeing what I needed to see, constructing a new narrative that was no more accurate than the first. The investigation had been thorough, professional, conducted by experienced people who knew their jobs. They'd examined the same evidence I was looking at now. They'd considered multiple possibilities before settling on their conclusion. What made me think I could see something they'd missed? But even as I questioned my own perceptions, I couldn't shake the feeling that the truth was still hidden somewhere in this room. In the way the shadows fell, in the rhythm of that impossible wind, in the careful arrangement of what was supposed to look like chaos. The coffee mug in the sink drew me back. I stared at its contents, trying to understand why it felt so significant. The liquid inside had separated into layers, creating patterns that looked almost like a map, or like a message written in a language I couldn't read. I reached toward it, then stopped. Some instinct warned me not to disturb whatever equilibrium existed in this space. The house had been showing me things, revealing secrets through small details and impossible phenomena. If I interfered too directly, if I tried to force answers instead of letting them emerge naturally, I might lose access to whatever truth was trying to surface. The shadow on the wall had grown longer while I stood there. It now reached almost to where I was standing, stretching toward me like a dark finger pointing in accusation. But accusing me of what? Of failing to see what was obvious, of seeing too much, of being complicit in some way I didn't understand. I thought about my own connection to this case, my own reasons for being here. Why had I been so invested in understanding what happened? What had drawn me back to this room months after everyone else had moved on? The official explanation should have been enough. The case was closed, the mystery solved, justice served as much as it could be. Yet here I stood, questioning everything, pulling at threads that might unravel not just the official narrative, but my own understanding of my role in accepting it. The wind moved through the house again, carrying with it the scent of something I couldn't identify, something that might have been fear or guilt or the lingering presence of secrets too dangerous to speak aloud. The papers on the desk rustled again, all except that one sheet that remained perfectly still. I stared at it, wondering what made it different from the others, what kept it anchored while everything around it moved. Was it heavier somehow, stuck to the surface, or was something else holding it in place? As I watched, the shadow on the wall began to shift, not growing longer now, but changing shape, becoming less like a finger and more like a question mark. The house was asking me something, but I didn't know how to answer. I wasn't even sure I understood the question. The clock's irregular rhythm grew more pronounced, its ticking becoming almost like a code. Short beats and long beats, fast sequences and slow ones. If I listened carefully enough, would it spell out the truth? Would it tell me who was really responsible for what happened in this room? But I was no longer sure I wanted to know the answer. The comfortable certainty of the official explanation was gone, replaced by a maze of possibilities that led in directions I wasn't prepared to explore. The victim might have been the perpetrator. The crime scene might have been staged. My own certainty might have been the biggest lie of all. Standing in that impossible space, watching shadows that shouldn't exist and listening to wind that had no source, I finally understood that some questions are more dangerous than their answers. Some truths are buried so deep that digging them up changes everything, including the person doing the digging. The shadow reached me at last, cool and substantial as it fell across my feet. In that moment, I realized I might never leave this room unchanged. Whatever I'd come here seeking, whatever I'd hoped to understand, had already transformed into something else entirely. The investigation was no longer about what happened that night. It was about what was happening right now, in this moment, as the house breathed around me, and the impossible wind carried its secrets through rooms that seemed to exist outside of time itself. Story 9. Raindrops pattered softly against the roof, a rhythmic lullaby that usually promised a peaceful evening. The hum of the refrigerator and the scent of freshly baked bread filled the kitchen, grounding the room in a sense of routine. Yet as the wind nudged open the shutters, they revealed an oddly cold draft wrapping itself around the kitchen table. The pantry door, usually shut tight by a stubborn latch, was slightly ajar, its dark interior whispering secrets. Above, a single light bulb flickered uncertainly, casting long shadows that crept across the floor like hesitant footsteps. A vague unease settled in, like waiting for an unexpected visitor who would never arrive. I keep touching the bruise on my wrist, purple-green now, fading at the edges. I tell myself I remember how it happened. The cabinet door swinging shut too fast, but my fingers trace its outline like reading Braille, searching for a different story. The neighbor's dog hasn't barked in 3 days. Strange, because that animal barked at everything. Leaves falling, cars passing, its own shadow. I used to complain about the noise. Now the silence feels heavier than sound ever did. There's a coffee cup on the counter that isn't mine. White porcelain, a small chip on the handle. I don't remember buying it, don't remember anyone drinking from it. But there it sits, a faint ring of coffee staining the bottom. When I touch it, it's still warm. I found the photograph tucked inside a book I haven't opened in months. A picture of me sleeping, taken from the doorway of my bedroom. The angle is wrong for a selfie. The lighting suggests early morning, that gray time before dawn when the world feels suspended between dreams and waking. My sister called, asked if I was feeling better from what I asked. The flu, she said. You called me crying about being sick, but I don't remember calling her. Don't remember being sick. My throat doesn't feel raw. My body doesn't ache with the memory of fever. The key under the flower pot is facing the wrong direction. Such a small thing, but I always place it teeth up, pointing toward the door. Now it lies teeth down, pointing away, as if someone replaced it carelessly without noticing the small ritual I've maintained for years. I've been walking the same route every evening, past the park, around the pond, back through the residential streets. The jogger with the red headband always passes me at the same corner. We nod, a brief acknowledgement between strangers sharing space, but tonight she stopped, asked if I was all right, said I looked pale, distracted. Had I been acting differently? The shower drain is clogged with hair that isn't mine, darker than my own, coarser. I pull it out in long strands, examining each one under the bathroom light. The texture feels familiar between my fingers, but I can't place where I've touched hair like this before. There are muddy footprints on my kitchen floor, small ones smaller than my feet. They lead from the back door to the pantry, then disappear. I follow their path, crouching down to examine the tread pattern. Work boots, maybe, or hiking shoes. The mud is still damp. I keep dreaming about a basement I don't have. Stone walls sweating moisture, a single bulb swaying from a cord. In the dream, I'm looking for something I've lost, something important. But when I wake, I can't remember what I was searching for, only the feeling of urgency, of time running out. The grocery store clerk asked about my friend, the one who comes in with me sometimes, buys organic vegetables and herbal tea. But I always shop alone, always have. When I told her this, she looked confused, insisted she'd seen us together just last week, described someone I'd never met, yet the description felt like recognizing a face in an old photograph. My handwriting appears in places I don't remember writing. Shopping lists in my kitchen drawer, written in my script but listing items I never buy. Notes tucked into books, reminders for appointments I never made. The ink is fresh, the paper clean, but the words feel foreign, like someone else wearing my skin. The basement door is locked from the inside, but this house doesn't have a basement, just a crawl space beneath the kitchen, barely tall enough to crouch in. Still, when I press my ear to the floorboards, I hear something, movement, breathing, the soft scrape of fabric against wood. I found a receipt in my pocket for gas purchased at a station I've never visited. The timestamp shows I was there during work hours, but I was at my desk all day. Colleagues can vouch for this. Yet there's my signature on the credit card slip, shaky but unmistakably mine. The mirror in my bathroom shows a reflection that's always slightly behind. When I raise my hand, the image follows a fraction of a second later. When I turn my head, the reflected movement lags. I tell myself it's the lighting, the angle, some trick of perception. But the delay is consistent, measurable. Someone has been reading my books. The spines show where I don't remember causing. Pages are dog-eared at passages I never marked. In the margins, notes appear in pencil, observations and questions in handwriting that looks like mine but slants differently, as if written by someone left-handed mimicking a right-handed script. The neighbor mentioned seeing lights in my house when I was away. I'd gone to visit my mother, stayed 3 days, but she swears she saw someone moving past the windows each evening, a silhouette that could have been me. The same height, the same build. When I checked the house after returning, nothing seemed disturbed. I keep finding small objects moved. A a pen placed on the wrong side of my desk, a book rotated 90 degrees on its shelf. The salt shaker switched positions with the pepper, changes so subtle I question whether I'm imagining them, whether my memory is playing tricks, creating patterns where none exist. The voicemail on my phone contains a message I left for myself. My own voice, tired and strained, saying I need to remember something important, that I should look in the place where I keep the things I want to forget. But I don't remember making the call, don't recognize the exhaustion in my voice. There's a worn path in my backyard grass leading from the kitchen door to the fence. I don't remember walking that route repeatedly, but the earth is packed down, the grass thin and yellowing. The pattern suggests months of regular use, someone taking the same steps over and over. I woke up with dirt under my fingernails, clean dirt, not the grimy residue of gardening, but fresh earth still cool to the touch. My shoes were by the door, mud caked on the soles. But I have no memory of going outside, no recollection of digging or planting or touching the ground. The photograph on my nightstand shows two people, but I only see one. When I look directly at it, there's just me, standing alone in front of a house I don't recognize. But in my peripheral vision, I catch glimpses of another figure. Someone standing close enough to cast a shadow, someone who disappears when I focus my attention. My neighbor's dog started barking again, but it's different now. Not the sharp, aggressive bark of territory being defended. This is something else, a whining, worried sound. The animal paces the fence line, staring at my house with an expression I can only describe as concerned, as if it's trying to warn me about something I can't see. The coffee cup is gone from my counter, but now there are two indentations in the couch cushions, as if someone had been sitting there recently. The fabric still holds the shape of a body smaller than mine, and when I press my hand into the depression, I feel residual warmth. I think I understand now why I keep touching this bruise. It's not trying to remember how it happened. It's trying to forget. Story 10. The cold glass stung my fingertips as I turned it shut. The watery whisper ceased, leaving an unexpected void that only the faint ticking of the kitchen clock dared fill. I pressed my ear to the door, the wood cool and resistant against my skin, hinting at more than its simple barrier. The whisper of my breath felt too loud, an intrusion in the unsettling quiet. My foot shifted on the worn tiles, and a strange texture caught beneath my heel. Something about the air was altered, thickened by a presence I could almost sense but not quite see. I keep coming back to this moment, the way the faucet handle felt under my palm, chrome worn smooth by countless hands. My hands, other hands too, I think. The memory fragments like light through water, distorting what I thought I knew. There was someone else in that kitchen, I'm certain of it now, though I can't quite grasp who. A shadow at the edge of my vision, moving just beyond where my recollection allows me to see clearly. Sometimes I think it was a woman, other times I'm not so sure. The presence had weight, substance, but when I try to focus on the details, they slip away like smoke. The texture under my heel, I've been trying to remember what that was. Gritty, not quite sand, not quite crumbs, something that shouldn't have been there on those clean tiles. I was always so careful about keeping the floor swept. Obsessive, some might say, but that night there was something foreign grinding beneath my shoe. Wait, was it night? The kitchen window shows only darkness in my memory, but that could mean anything. The curtains were drawn. They were always drawn by then. I remember insisting on that, though I can't recall why it felt so important. Privacy, maybe. Or was I hiding something from the outside, or keeping something outside from looking in? The clock's ticking seems louder now when I think about it. Aggressive, almost. Marking time I can't quite account for. There are gaps in that evening, spaces where my mind goes blank or veers away from something it doesn't want to examine, like a tongue avoiding a sore tooth. I had been washing something, a glass, yes, but what else? My hands remember the motion of scrubbing, the warm soapy water, but when I try to picture what I was cleaning, the image blurs. Plates, maybe. Or was it something else entirely? Something that needed more careful attention, more thorough cleaning than usual. The other person in the kitchen, they weren't helping, just watching. I can feel their gaze on my back even now, a weight between my shoulder blades. Were they sitting, standing? I turn around in my memory, but the figure remains just out of focus, like trying to see something in peripheral vision that vanishes when you look directly at it. You missed the spot. Did someone say that? The voice echoes strangely in my recollection, neither clearly male nor female. Maybe I said it to myself. I had a habit of talking while I worked, filling the silence with commentary that no one else needed to hear. But this felt different, directed, critical. The door I pressed my ear against led to the basement, I know that much. The wood was painted white but chipped near the handle from years of use. Beyond it, darkness stretched down wooden steps that creaked in a familiar pattern. I knew those stairs well, could navigate them without light. But that evening, something about the basement felt different, occupied maybe, or recently disturbed. My breath fogged the glass of the window above the sink. I remember watching the condensation form and fade, matching my nervous exhalations. Outside, nothing moved, or at least nothing I could see, but the feeling of being observed persisted, as if the darkness itself had eyes. The strange texture under my foot, I bent to look, I think, or maybe I just imagined bending. The motion feels uncertain in my memory, but there was definitely something there, small pieces of something that crunched when I shifted my weight. Not food, not the usual kitchen debris, something else entirely. Don't. Another voice, or the same voice with a different tone, this one sharper, more urgent, a warning maybe, or a command. I straightened up, abandoning whatever investigation I might have been conducting. Some instinct told me not to look too closely, not to ask too many questions. The other presence moved then, I'm sure of it, a shifting in the air, the soft whisper of fabric or skin against fabric. They were closer than before, close enough that I should have been able to turn and see them clearly, but I didn't turn. Something held me facing the sink, hands still moving in the soapy water, pretending that everything was normal. Normal, what a strange word to apply to that evening. Nothing about it felt normal, even as I went through the motions of routine tasks. The washing, the careful placement of clean items on the drying rack, the methodical wiping down of surfaces, all performed with the mechanical precision of someone trying very hard not to think about something else. The basement door, why did I check it? The handle turned easily under my palm, no resistance, no sign that it had been recently used. But the air that drifted up from below carried a scent I couldn't identify, earthy but with an undertone of something else. Something that made me pull back and close the door quickly, as if I'd opened something I shouldn't have. My reflection in the kitchen window showed a face I barely recognized. Pale, drawn, with eyes that seemed to be looking at something beyond what was actually there. When did I start looking like that? The change must have been gradual, but in that moment, catching sight of myself in the glass, it felt sudden and alarming. The other person spoke again, I'm certain of it now, though the words remain frustratingly unclear. Something about time, maybe, or timing. A reminder of something I was supposed to do or supposed to remember. But when I try to focus on the actual words, they dissolve like sugar in water. I had been expecting someone that evening, or maybe someone had been expecting me. The distinction feels important, but I can't grasp why. There was an appointment of sorts, an understanding, a plan that had been set in motion. But the details remained maddeningly vague, as if someone had taken an eraser to the crucial parts of my memory. The texture under my heel again. I keep returning to this detail because it feels significant, a clue to something larger that I'm missing. When I finally looked down, really looked, what did I see? The memory skips like a damaged recording, jumping from the moment of curiosity to a later moment of cleanup, missing the crucial revelation in between. Cleanup, yes, there was definitely cleanup involved, more than the usual tidying. I remember the careful attention to detail, the way I checked and rechecked every surface, every corner, making sure nothing was missed, nothing left behind that shouldn't be there. But what was I cleaning up, and why did it feel so urgent, so necessary? The other presents grew quieter as the evening progressed, less movement, less commentary. Eventually, I realized I could no longer sense them at all. Had they left? Or had they simply become so still that they blended into the background silence? The distinction troubled me more than it should have. I stood at that sink for a long time after the washing was done, hands empty but still moving through the motions, as if muscle memory was trying to complete a task my conscious mind had forgotten. The water had long since drained away, but I could still feel its warmth on my skin, still smell the sharp scent of the soap I'd used. The basement door drew my attention again. This time when I pressed my ear against it, I thought I heard something, not quite a sound, but a disturbance in the silence, like the echo of movement that had already stopped. I turned the handle again, more slowly this time, and peered into the darkness below. The steps descended into shadow, each one familiar yet somehow foreign. I knew I should go down and check, should satisfy the nagging curiosity that pulled at me. But my feet remained planted on the kitchen tiles, unwilling to carry me into that uncertain darkness. Some part of me understood that once I went down those stairs, I might learn something I wasn't prepared to know. Instead, I closed the door and turned the lock. The small click seemed unnaturally loud in the quiet kitchen. When had I started locking that door? It wasn't something I remembered doing before, but the motion felt automatic, practiced, as if it had become a necessary precaution. The strange texture under my foot was gone when I looked again. The tiles were clean, swept, showing no sign of whatever I had felt earlier. But the memory of that gritty sensation remained, along with the uncomfortable certainty that its absence was more troubling than its presence had been. I find myself back at the sink now, running water over my hands even though they're already clean. The faucet handle still bears the memory of that evening, still carries the weight of whatever happened in this kitchen. But the details continue to slip away, leaving only impressions and the persistent feeling that I'm missing something crucial. The cold glass stings my fingertips as I turn it shut once more. The watery whisper ceases, and I'm left with the same unsettling quiet, the same sense of a presence just beyond perception. My foot shifts on the worn tiles, searching for a texture that's no longer there, while my ear strains toward a door that holds its secrets behind painted wood and a lock I don't remember installing.